We all operate on the theory that in the end, liberals always win. And that isn't just braggadocio, it's just that if you look at our culture and our society over the last 100 years, in the end, even though there are individual elections we lose and individual issues which we lose, ultimately the liberal position becomes mainstream in the way America goes. Every generation is more liberal than the generation before it on any cultural issue you can think of. And so it is true liberals always win, and the most recent major victory is, for example, gay marriage, which 20 years ago was unthinkable. And so the question now is, does that, and you were saying because liberals always win, in the end, eventually enough people, because the polls show that most people want some kind of gun control, certainly some of these massive weapons, that you would think at some point the politicians will turn around and do something about it. And so that's my only hope, that might at some point happen, though right now, I got to admit, I'm very cynical about all this. And what makes me cynical about it is I have seen this script. It's a replay. All you do is put in different numbers in a different city. Yeah. I remember back, for people not from this area, 30 years ago, I was a news anchor on the NBC affiliate here in Cincinnati. And we used to joke, and this is true, we used to joke, because we were local news, that we could write one script for our news and just come in an hour early before we broadcast and put in the relevant dates, the relevant names and numbers, because every broadcast was the same. Good evening, there's been an auto accident on, and we put in the name of the street, and and we'll have details later on in the newscast. Such and such was indicted today, whatever. So the news headlines every day on local news was always the same. As I said, only the names and the numbers changed. And so we kind of joked about that. Well, now, which obviously is not a joke, the script, I mean, you start watching cable news and you watch the newscasts, and we all were the past few days. Oh my gosh, how, if you have left the planet for a couple of months, you come back, you didn't know where this was. It's the same thing. Bodies strewn over the place. They think they got the killer. How many were involved? Videos of people there. The interviews with people that were at the scene. And then the politicians, the White House speaks. And this time what I found so appalling about it is, or at least at first interesting, is the presidential statement. This Trump guy, he has, with every one of the disasters that has taken place with shootings over the last, 2 years, he always is quick. The very first thing he says or tweets has to do with, we need to ban these people. It's an obvious terrorist act. I should be congratulated. I was right, etc. And it was interesting. There was no such thing this time. And the only reason I can see for no mention of anything with this shooting was that the shooter happened to be a white American Christian. And Trump politically can't ban white American Christians. So for the first time, he didn't talk about what the problem is. In other words, his solution always was ban this group, ban the Muslims. But when it comes to dealing with what this issue was, which obviously is an issue about certain types of guns and what people can do to guns to make them assault weapons, he didn't want to talk about that because there is documentary evidence that he is in bed with the NRA. And he says, you had my back, I will always have your back. Those were his words, by the way. So he's not going to do anything. And truthfully, the Republican Congress and the Republican Senate is not going to do anything either. So that's the second thing that came out of the White House. The first thing I noticed was the silence. on the substantive issue of what's at stake here with all these people dying and, over 500 already hurt. The second thing that got me was then when they said from the White House, we're not going to politicize this. This is no time, when people started talking about some kind of gun control and what are we going to do about these weapons. The White House says, this is no time to become political. Let's not throw politics. I think it was Sean Hannity said, it's shameful that the left is bringing up gun control at a time like this when families are grieving. Well, you know what? Nobody said that on 9/11 that we can't mention terrorism. As soon as 9/11 hit, as soon as the second plane hit, everybody was talking about terrorism. And the right wing wasn't saying it's too early to start talking about this stuff, who's to blame and all that. So they don't want to talk about gun control. And the reason they don't want to talk about any kind of gun control is because, as we all know, almost every Republican politician, and even some Democratic politicians, but mostly Republican politicians, the alt-right and the NRA run our government on this issue because they will primary out any Republican or any politician who's in favor of anything, even the most sensible ideas. So why wouldn't we talk about gun control? Every poll shows most Americans understand that certain kinds of weapons have no place in our society. The only reason, and I'm going to use a general term, even though those who really know guns know that it isn't but when I say assault weapons, you know what I'm talking about. You do something to a gun that permits it to fire off tons of rounds within a few seconds, So the only purpose of that weapon outside of the military is to kill as many people as possible in as short a time as possible. That is the only purpose of the weapon. The weapon has no use in sport. You wouldn't use that in hunting. You don't need that for target practice. It's not a weapon that you need to protect your home. You don't need to fire, 1,000 rounds or 500 rounds in 30 seconds to protect your home. It's not needed because the government is taking over. I mean, really, are there any people left in our country that believe that you have to have your own personal machine gun or assault weapon because the government's coming after you? First of all, what a stupid idea to begin with. But secondly, if you really think the government's coming after us with weapons, do you not think they would send a drone over to drop some kind of they'd vaporize us? The government's going to show up, let's not, this guy's got a machine gun, we better leave that house alone. I mean, there's no logical reason for having these weapons other than collectors or people that want to kill a lot of people. Now, you can say that the NRA will say, well, wait a second, we don't need to get into all this. The Second Amendment protects us. Well, time out. First of all, it's certainly debatable that the Second Amendment was dealing with the right to form a militia, which is the first clause of the Second Amendment, and so that's why you need the weapons. Well, these guys aren't joining a militia. But beyond that, the Supreme Court has already said some gun control is okay because obviously we do have gun control laws in some states. So obviously it's constitutional. But secondly, even if you're a purist and say the Second Amendment grants everybody the right to have a gun, every constitutional right is allowed to be temporized if there is, and the legal words are if there's a legitimate governmental function. So we have the right of free speech, but the government is allowed to restrict certain kinds of speech if there is a legitimate governmental purpose, such as pornography, yelling fire in the theater. So there are exceptions to every right that we have. it's the burden's on the government to prove that there's, as I said, a legitimate governmental purpose. Who doesn't believe that public safety is a legitimate public purpose? Of course it is. The government's there to provide protection. So there's no possible argument for not having enough control to say that these weapons of, in a sense, mass destruction should not be permitted to be purchased by individual citizens that aren't part of the military. And the only reason we don't get this legislation is because the Republican Party, which is in charge of the Congress and the Senate, they owe their political existence to the NRA, because if they go against them, they will be funded by someone who runs against them and they will lose. And they are in control. And I think we've reached the point now where somebody's got to be willing to stand up. The reason I'm pessimistic is there are structural parts of our government that won't permit us to change the Congress or the Senate, particularly on an issue such as this. We tend to think the Senate is more progressive than the House. We know the problem with the House is gerrymandering. Well, the Supreme Court is dealing with that issue right now. But even though most people vote Democrat, we have a Republican Congress because of the way the districts are drawn. And we've wound up where they take the Democratic votes and they pile them all into one district, so there are not enough Democratic votes in the other districts to make sure that they can win some of those. So we understand that. But the Senate, do not believe that the Senate is necessarily a progressive entity, particularly on issues like guns. Why? Well, our founders, when they created the Senate, which was the deal so that we could get the Constitution passed, the idea was the House would be based on population, but the Senate, each state, even the small states, would get 2 senators. So a state like Wyoming, which has about as many people as Ludlow, Kentucky, they get as many senators as California or New York. So basically, the Senate is made up, and most of the states, the middle of the country, most of the states are primarily rural. Most of the land mass in America is rural. The big cities are all on the coast, except in Chicago and, Cleveland, whatever. But, the population is amassed on the coasts. But they only get their 2 senators. You put all the middle states together, even though they're only 20, 30% of the country in terms of population, they have a majority of the Senate. And these rural areas do want to hold on to their guns. Because there is some, not assault weapons, but there is a necessity. The people that live there want to hold on to their guns for safety. They live out in rural areas, etc. I get it. But if you know this structural difference, how are we ever, I don't care what the polls show about more people want more gun control, as long as most of the senators live in rural states and represent rural states, it's going to be very difficult to pass the legislation that most Americans, any reasonable person would say you don't have to have assault weapons. And so we're going to continue to have these headlines. You got 59 dead so far. You've got over 500 wounded. We don't know how many more of them are going to die, even as we're talking. By the time people hear this podcast, those that aren't listening live, that number will likely rise. And you know what? Those politicians are going to say, every one of them, and it's sickening, they're all going to say, our thoughts and our prayers go out to these people. They all say that. That's like saying to someone, have a nice day, after they hand you a cup of coffee. It's just something you say. You walk by, hey, how you doing? It's a nice thing to say, but it's meaningless in solving the problem. Thoughts and prayers? We elected you not to be our ministers, not to be our rabbis with your prayers. We elected you to do something with legislation in our government, and you're doing nothing. They are doing nothing. These people ought to be thrown out of office. And, you know, if they want to have a new saying, instead of saying, our thoughts and prayers are with you, which they say by rote every single time, they should remember Dylan's line, how many deaths will it take till we know that too many people have died?